Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for responding to the invitation to join us for this fourth session in the first series of the Decolonization Learning Journey. We're delighted to have Cheryl Knockwood with us today for teachings on Indian Reserves, the Indian Act, and Confederation. My name is Nicole Cameron, and I'm the Associate Executive Director at the Community Sector Council of Nova Scotia. I'm one of the three-person hosting team members for this journey. This initiative is made possible through a unique partnership with Untitled College at Cape Breton University and through the generous funding support from the province of Nova Scotia, through the Departments of Communities, Culture and Heritage, as well as Labour and Advanced Education. I just want to say a few words about this program as we start to wind down this first series. So I wanted to remind people that the design of the program in each individual session is very intentional, in that we've really tried to create space for deep learning before we move into a place of action. So we've really designed these sessions with 4 key elements in mind. And the first is listen, listen, listen. The second is unlearn and relearn. So learning and unlearning together Canada's shared history with Indigenous people. And the third is to reflect, where we're really trying to encourage people to make this learning personal. How does this new understanding feel for you as the learner? And lastly, as we move into sort of the final cycle of this series, is to act with wisdom and empathy. So how do we incorporate our reconciliation learning into our work and into our everyday lives? And how do we do that at a systems level to create respectful, equitable, peaceful, and thriving communities here in Nova Scotia and right across Canada? So with this design in mind, please know that we will be breaking for the summer months and we'll reconvene. The plan is mid-September for Series 2. And each series has 4 different sessions in it under a theme. So Series 2 theme is Indigenous Rights, Governance, and Residential Schools. And following that session, Series 3 is National Inquiries, Two-Eyed Seeing, Education and Language, and Social Challenges. And after those 3 series, this being the first, then we start to move into Series 4, which is moving then into a place of collaborative action, where we start to ask ourselves and our organizations, now what? How do we incorporate reconciliation learning into our work and our everyday lives? So we hope you'll continue this journey with us into the fall and into the winter of next year so we can move into that intentional place of action. So before we get started today, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. This is a review for many of you who are joining us for the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th time. You're joining today with audio only. So you're in listen mode only. We have approximately just over 500 people registered for the call today, right across Canada, from Dawson City right to St. John's. So what that means is you can't actually ask a question except for in the question box in the control panel. So if you'd like to forward questions there, that would be great. We'll do our best to get to those questions, but again, given that there are so many on the call and you're a very engaged bunch, we may not get to all of them. So that said, we do develop a resource package for after the session. So some of those questions that are left unanswered in this webinar will be provided in the resource material that we send out afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to welcome the other 2 parts of our hosting team, and that is Mary Beth Doucette and Elder Jane Meter. So I'll pass it over to you, Mary Beth.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, so I guess I'm happy to welcome you all virtually through the magic of the internet to Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And now I'd like to invite Elder Jane Meter to open the session with a prayer.
Thank you. Isok, Inis Kamijina, Gugumijina, Aksa Highway, Wiwalu like Uchidula Nagud, Ahedamo like at Quay winning Gisko, Asiawi Abahani winning, Yes was Kumkuchik, Ahagana Mahachik, Activik Skijino. Iginamuyak and Siduohan, Exalsodi, Amal Giganodi, Laman Dandesiak, Isiawatisnen, Akislugotisnen, on the Wimptimodahan, Nadliach, Sidnogama. And the translation is creator, grandfathers, grandmothers, and ancestors. We are grateful to you for this day, and we ask that you remain with us today. We humbly ask for your assistance as we address and teach other people about the Mi'kmaq. Grant us wisdom, love, and strength. Grant wisdom, love, and strength to all of us so that we can continue to do our work together in a careful and proper manner in promoting Indigenous matters or concerns. All my relations. Thank you.
Well, and Jane. So as Nicole was saying, this is the fourth of the first four-part series, and I'm really hopeful that everybody who's been joining in, I'm grateful that you've been joining in, and I'm hopeful that you're taking lots of learning away from these sessions and increasing some of the thoughts that you're thinking about what all this means, what the treaties mean, and what it means to live in Nova Scotia, which is treaty territory. As Nicole indicated, these discussions are ongoing, and they're going to be going on right into the fall and then beyond then too, I'm sure. So if we don't get to all the questions, we will get there eventually. Some of the questions are so big, they don't have answers yet. so I think that's important to keep in mind. I'm really excited that Cheryl Knockwood's going to be our speaker today. I have worked with Cheryl in the past on different projects with the Membertou Governance Committee, and she's always fun. I love being in spaces with Cheryl. She always makes me laugh, and always fun. And I'm going to read her bio in a second, but before then, I'll just ask Jane if you have any opening thoughts on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon.
Not really, but like you, I just want people to know what a great human being Cheryl is. I've known her for a long while. Her sister's married to my youngest brother, and so I've known Cheryl for quite a while, and I feel that I have been very blessed in knowing her and her partner, and just really love her a whole lot.
Love you too. Love both of you guys. Hope you cry.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jane. So Cheryl Knockwood is the governance coordinator at Membertou, and she is assisting Membertou with the development of its laws in relation to land management and citizenship. Previously, she's worked as a senior policy analyst with the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs, and while she was there, she held several different portfolios with the organization, including fisheries, the environment, treaty education, and economic development. So Cheryl's a very well-rounded source of knowledge. She knows how things fit together. And she's also now the chair of the Human Rights Commission of Nova Scotia. And so I'm so glad that you were able to make some time to join us and talk to us about these important issues. So on that, welcome Cheryl, and I think we're going to be going off video and you'll be putting your PowerPoint up.
Well, Alio, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I had a pleasure working with Mary Beth for so many years, and I miss working with you. So thank you for that kind introduction. And Janie, I love you. You've been family to me for a very, very long time. And I'm so honored to share this journey with both of you. And of course, everyone else who's on the screen right now. thank you and for giving me this opportunity to share what information that I have to share with you today. And hopefully it will help in your learning journey in the challenge that was given earlier to open our minds and open our hearts and to learn other teachings and make that into part of your life and hopefully help you and all of us make this world a better place. So I'll just start with saying Nina Louise Cheryl Knockwood do Onogeish ka Leo Yaish Signik District Nige Wigi Unamagi District. Yeah, Nuchewiji Louise Jigaish Vincent Knockwood Serena Francis Git Leo Jigaish Signik District. Nucho Nige Waso 8 was Ninkijme still Meskil Kaish Dawan Izibo Anamwida Izigano with Baltangoya Wegi Migwam each Wegig Salt. So that was my way of in Mi'kmaq introducing who I am and where I'm from. And so without further ado, I am going to share my screen. Show my screen. Okay. All right. So I have the honor today to share information about Indian Act reserves in the Confederation. And it's a history that goes few hundred years back. And I wanted to start off the presentation by showing Mi'kmaq territory. This is a picture. I'm not sure who made the map. It wasn't myself, but it's just a quick little image of what is considered Mi'kmaqi or the territory of the Mi'kmaq. So it is now known as Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, eastern regions of New Brunswick, Gaspé regions of Quebec, and St. Pierre-Miquelon, as well as parts of Maine. Gives you an idea of how large our territory is. Also wanted to share an image. I'm not sure if it's coming up really well on the screen. I know it's a little blurry in mine, but just another image, photograph that was taken of a Mi'kmaq family. Looks like grandparents with their grandchild and wearing a Mi'kmaq peaked hat and the skirt and the coat with designs that mean a lot to the Mi'kmaq. I also wanted to share this image. I probably should know the name of the person who painted this, and Janie probably knows and could share that knowledge with us. But I really like it because it shows a snapshot in time of the life of the Mi'kmaq. And what I like to point out when I talk to my students is, as you can see in the background, the wigwams, you know, they're made of birch bark. And the canoe, it has a distinct shape to it. The Mi'kmaq had a distinct shaped canoe. And the distinct shape to it is the curve in the middle of the canoe. And you can see the peaked hats in there. And then you can see the omoj in the middle of the photo. When we talk about Indian Act reserves and Confederation, we've got to realize that there was a history before the Indian Act and before colonization. And I listened to the presentation that Stephen Augustine had made the last session that this was held. And he did a really good history of talking about Mi'kmaq diplomacy and the history of contact. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but just to reiterate that the Mi'kmaq have a long history of diplomacy. That history goes pre-contact, and it continued, and that still continues to today, Mi'kmaq diplomacy. But just an example of one, for instance, is the Wabanaki Confederacy. And the Wabanaki Confederacy, if we're talking about confederation later on, confederation is a meeting of different nations and coming together and creating something. So previous to Canada becoming confederated and becoming a country, there was the Wabanaki Confederacy here in this region, and it was an alliance of 4 other nations: the Abenaki, 5 with the Mi'kmaq, the Abenaki, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, and the Maliseet, or the Wolastoqiyik. And these nations ranged in areas that are now in New England, United States, and the Maritime provinces of Canada. I like to show this image too of a wampum, how we as Mi'kmaq and other indigenous nations in North America, or Mother Earth, or Turtle Island, depending on what you want to call it, we commemorated our unions, our confederacies, and through the tradition of wampum beads or wampum making. And so the wampum belt that you see here is the Wabanaki wampum. And so in the middle, if everyone takes a quick look at it, can you make out the image of the beads? And I'll put, I'm not sure if my arrow will show here, but this here is a pipe. So that was an important symbol of peace to us as Mi'kmaq people. And so this Wabanaki wampum belt commemorated the peace agreement between the Wabanaki nations. And that history of Mi'kmaq diplomacy continued through different periods of time. So pre-contact with European culture, we had confederacies, we had extensive trade networks, we worked with other indigenous people all across the eastern seaboard. And when the first Europeans arrived, which were the French, we extended that system of diplomacy and kinship that we had already established with other indigenous nations, which was the act of creating peace and also extending our family system. So it was really important to the Mi'kmaq to extend our kinship, our family systems. And so when the French arrived, we did the same, practiced the same teachings, which was to extend our kinship to the newcomers, to the French. And so one of the ways that was commemorated and honored to show a sign of alliance and good faith was for the Grand Chief of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council at the time, Membertou, to whom the community of Membertou in Sydney currently is named after. But Grand Chief Membertou lived in the Annapolis Royal area, and he was baptized June 24th, 1610, and given the name Henry, and baptized with the name Henry because Henry was the King of France or England or somewhere like that at the time. And and then in 1629, the Mi'kmaq adopted Saint Anne as a patron saint. And if you look at Mi'kmaq culture, the grandmother, we have a very strong clan system of clan mothers, and grandmothers play the most very important role within our families to this day. So the fact that our Mi'kmaq back in the 1600s adopted Saint Anne, who was the grandmother of Jesus, is not surprising, because the grandmother played and continues to play a very important role to the Mi'kmaq. And so when learning about a different faith, we said, oh, there's a grandmother, Jesus' grandmother saint, yes. And so if you look in many Mi'kmaq communities that does have a Catholic church, it's usually Saint Anne's church. Although in the community that I am from, Olno-Minigog, Indian Island, in Shubenacadie district, St. Catherine Takawita is the name of our church. Canada commemorated Membertou and created a postage stamp for him. So as you can see there, that's the postage stamp that was created of Chief Membertou at the time. So we move along into the diplomacy and the diplomatic relations we created with English. When the English came into our territory. And so with the English, we practiced treaty making and entered into a treaty relationship. And I do believe Steve and Augustine talked a lot about those treaties at the last session, so I'm not going to speak too much about them other than, you know, depending on who you ask, they say there are from 11 to 30 treaties that the Mi'kmaq signed with the British government. And why is there a range and why isn't there a definitive number? The reason why that is because some treaties were referred to in some historical documents at the time and included in minutes, but no one's ever found actual copies of the treaty. So there's references made to different treaties in the minutes, but not the actual treaties. So then that's why the number ranges. But the treaties that you see here listed are the treaties you can find online. If you Google 1725 Dummer's Treaty, you'll find it. If you Google any one of these treaties, you'll see the number of treaties. I mean, they're not the number, the peace and friendship treaties that the Mi'kmaq signed. And as you can tell, they were all signed before Canada became a country. And, you know, the international law of treaty making is, you know, it's only nations that can enter into treaties. It's not individuals. So pre-Confederation, before Canada became a country, the British government came and interacted with my Mi'kmaq ancestors as equal sovereign nations and entered into peace and friendship treaties with my ancestors. And so it's really important, and I know the province of Nova Scotia, and I've heard a lot of Mi'kmaq people say the treaties aren't just Mi'kmaq's, the treaties are all of ours, Canadians as well as Mi'kmaq, because it was two nations that entered into those treaties, and we all are treaty people and we're all responsible for implementing those treaties. So here's just a couple of pictures of a couple treaties, 1726 and 1752. And like I said, you can Google these. The neat thing about the 1726, if you do Google it and are able to find the one of the original versions to it, you'll see that the treaties were signed by our Mi'kmaq chiefs using symbols. And the symbols are different animal symbols. So it shows the clan systems were used in signing of the treaties back in that day. So my presentation is talking about the colonial history, Indian Act, Reserves, and Confederation. I wanted to couch my presentation in the prehistory of colonization to share that the Mi'kmaq were diplomatic peoples. They were a nation. We entered into treaties. We had our own government systems. We had the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. We entered into extensive confederations and agreements and trade networks with other indigenous nations all across the eastern seaboard of what is now known as North America. And so when Canada became a country in 1867, it became a country and started ignoring that early treaty making diplomatic history of the indigenous people they encountered with. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. When Canada became a country and passed its first constitution, which was then known as the British North America Act of 1867, under Section 91 of that constitution, it gave the federal government control over Native issues. And that is why the federal government to this day is the government in Canada that's responsible for relations with quote unquote Indians, because that's the term that they called. At the time of Confederation, there was many indigenous nations all across Canada. I've read there was over 50, and they're currently divided into over 630 First Nation communities all across Canada at this moment in time. At the time of Confederation, the Prime Minister was John A. Macdonald, and he was the Prime Minister who is responsible for one of the architects of creating the Constitution and creating our country, but he was also the architect of the legislation called the Indian Act. In the Indian Act, the piece of legislation which was aimed towards assimilating, and that's a word that means getting rid of First Nations people. So the quote that is used a lot when they talk about John A. Macdonald when he devised the Indian Act, he has been quoted as saying, "The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal systems and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change." So that's why I wanted to talk about the history of the Mi'kmaq Pre-Confederation, because it was a rich history, and to share that when the Indian Act was created, it was meant to destroy everything and anything that was Indigenous. And the first Indian Act was created into law in 1876. And in order to become a Canadian at that time, Indians, which again put in quotations, weren't considered Canadian. They were considered Indians, and in order to become Canadians under the Indian Act, they had to relinquish their heritage and relinquish who they are as Indians. And not a lot of Mi'kmaq and Indigenous people across Canada were receptive to that, obviously. So what is the Indian Act, and why do we call it colonization and treaty denial period? I'm just gonna, there's actually a video that will be shared, a link to it after, that talks about the Indian Act. It was done by the 8th Fire Web Canoe. You can probably Google that on YouTube, but the link will be shared with you later. That does a really quick history of the Indian Act and what it did. But just because not a lot of Canadians know that the Indian Act was created specifically to assimilate Indigenous people, and there was many things that it was designed to do, and one of them was to deny Indigenous women status as Indians, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But essentially, what it meant is if an Indigenous woman, Indian woman, married a non-Indian man, she would lose her Indian status. She would no longer be considered Indian. So that was one of the things of the Indian Act. The other thing the Indian Act did is it introduced residential schools, and I'll speak a little bit more about that. It also created reserves, so it ignored the traditional territories of the Indigenous nations in Canada, and created bodies of land that certain members were allowed to live on, and so it created the reserve system. And the land base of the reserve system is so small in Canada that, and most of the reserve lands that were created were either on swamplands or on rocky areas. And so usually the prime property or prime land bases were left to Canadians, and the reserves were created in pockets of land far away from the main settlements of the Canadians. And so it was a creation of the reserve system. It renamed individuals, individuals, and gave them European names. It also restricted Indigenous people or First Nations or Indians, Mi'kmaq, and other nations from leaving the reserve land without permission from the Indian agent. And the Indian agent was the person that worked for the Canadian government and who was responsible for implementing the Indian Act. And so that person had a lot of power within each of the regions across Canada, and you had to have permission from the Indian agent to leave the reserves. The Indian Act also enforced enfranchisement. What does enfranchisement mean? So under the Indian Act, I already mentioned earlier that when Indigenous or Indian women married non-Indigenous people, they lost their status as an Indian. They were no longer considered Indian, or they could no longer participate and live in their communities, the reserves. But there was also other ways people lost their status. And one of them was if you went to university and got a degree, you would lose your status. You would no longer be considered Indian. You would then become a Canadian citizen. If you became a nun or a sister or a priest, you would also lose your status. So there was many different ways where the Canadian government designed it through the Indian Act to assimilate or get rid of Indians by turning them for them to lose their status. And like I said, one of them was just simply by going to university. The Indian Act could also expropriate portions of reserves for other purposes, such as roads, railways, public works. As well, they could move an entire reserve away from a municipality if it was deemed expedient, which is unfortunately what happened in the case of Membertou. Membertou, the community of Membertou, there's actually another video that was made. Maybe we'll share the link to that as well, about the history of what happened in Membertou when they were moved from Wolastoqiyik on Kings Road up to the location where they are right now. The other thing the Indian Act did is it could lease out uncultivated reserve lands to non-First Nations, and that way the new lease holder could use it for farming or pasture. Colonization and treaty denial. The Indian Act, the other thing the Indian Act did is it forbade First Nations from forming political organizations. The other thing the Indian Act did is it prohibited First Nations from hiring lawyers or getting legal representation against the federal government. The federal government would actually have to approve the hiring of the lawyers. Other things, other fun facts about the Indian Act that many people might not be aware of is the Indian Act also prohibited the sale of alcohol to First Nations. It also prohibited the sale of ammunition to First Nations, and also prohibited pool hall owners from allowing First Nations entrance into the areas. And it also imposed a type of governance system called band council systems within all communities across Canada, irregardless of what the traditional governance systems were. So I talked earlier that the Indian Act was responsible for the residential schools. So I'm going to give a little local perspective on that. So the residential school in Atlantic region was operating from 1923 to 1967. My father, my uncle, and my aunt were victims or survivors of the residential school system. I use the term survivor lightly because my father never recovered from that system, and he died when he was pretty young. And so the trauma that was inflicted upon him was something he never could heal from, as well as many other people and people who are survivors of the residential school system all across Canada. And the primary purpose as to why the residential schools were created, again, was to get rid of the Indian in the child. So it was, and the commissions that have come out recently, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry had stated, you know, what Canada committed was an act of genocide, and and one of its primary tools of genocide was removing generations of children from their teachers, from their parents, from their elders, and trying to indoctrinate them in being Canadians. There was only one residential school that operated in the Atlantic Canada, but it was for all Atlantic First Nations. And the school that was the residential school in Canada was in Shubenacadie, and it was destroyed in a fire in 1986. And as I mentioned earlier, what the inquiry of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls had said, but also the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had also found that residential schools were also cultural genocide. So in this picture here, that's the picture of the residential school in Shubenacadie that was burnt down in the 1980s. Here's another image of students within the residential school. Whenever I see these images, I often look really hard to see if I can make out my father or my uncle or my aunt, to see if I can see their face in those images. I haven't found them yet, but so here's one image. So back into colonization and the treaty denial period. So in specific to this area, in 1942, the Indian Affairs Branch, which was responsible to implement policies within Canada for Canada against Onos or Indians, they introduced a centralization program in Nova Scotia, and its primary purpose was to, again, take more land away from Indigenous people, because currently in Nova Scotia, there are 13 reserves, and they try to have everybody move to 2 reserves, Eskasoni and Shubenacadie. And so to this day, the impacts of that is that Shubenacadie and Eskasoni are the 2 largest populated Mi'kmaq communities within Nova Scotia, but there was many families who refused to leave. And so that's the reason why the remaining communities still exist to this day, because there was Mi'kmaq who resisted that policy and refused to move their homes and homelands. So by 1949, the government realized that the centralization policy and trying to get the other 11 reserves shut down, closed, wasn't going to work. And so they lost interest in the centralization policy. In 1981 or 1951, there were some revisions made to the Indian Act. As I mentioned earlier, the Indian Act outlawed traditional practices of Indigenous people across Canada. And so in 1951, they made amendments to the policy. So to the act, and they said, okay, we're starting to allow traditional ceremonies. Yeah, and then they also, wait a minute. It's hard for me to read that one because it's there's something over it. I just want to make sure I say it right. Yeah, so that's what yeah. So they removed the ban against traditional ceremonies in 1951. And in 1956, that's when the Canadian government granted citizenship to Indigenous people or Aboriginals or Indians. So previous to that, previous to 1956, the Canadian government didn't recognize Indigenous people as Canadians. And so they changed that in 1956. And in 1960, it was the first time that Indigenous people were allowed to vote in Canada in federal and provincial elections. Because previous to that, if Indigenous people, because we weren't considered Canadian citizens, we would have to lose our status as Indians, again, vote Indians, and to be treated like Canadians. And so they, in 1960, Canada just eliminated that portion of it and decided to include Indigenous people as Canadians. So in 1985, a lot of these changes in the Indian Act don't necessarily come out because of the benevolence of the Canadian government. They come out because Indigenous people are resisting these laws and are actually going to court to try to get things changed. And so earlier I had mentioned that Indigenous women, if they married non-Indigenous men, they would lose their status and they weren't considered Indian anymore, and they wouldn't have status, and they wouldn't be able to live in their communities. And so there was a lot of resistance, and there was actually who was the current senator, one of the first senators, Aboriginal senators of Canada, Sandra Lovelace. She took this battle to the United Nations, and because of because of the work of Senator Lovelace, and other women, it forced Canada to change the law so it wouldn't discriminate against Indigenous women. And so Bill C-31 came into effect as a result of that, and it got rid of that initial discrimination against Indigenous women who married non-Indigenous people. They would no longer lose their status after 1985, and those who did previous to 1985 were able to apply to get their status back. But what ended up happening is that discrimination continued to the grandchildren's generation. So in 2011, Bill C-3 came into effect, granting status to the grandchildren of the Indigenous women who married out. But then it still maintained that discrimination, because when they were comparing that Indigenous woman who married out, who got their status, with their brother who may or may not have married Native or non-Native, because that was the other thing about the Indian Act. Non-Indigenous women could gain status as Indians if they were married to an Indian man. So in 2018, Bill S-3 was passed that dealt with the cousins issue, because what would happen is the cousin of the woman who married out, their grandchildren versus the grandchildren of her brothers, they had different status under the Indian Act status system, which even though they were considered status, it was a different level or tier of status. And so the courts found that that was discriminatory too. And so Bill S-3 was passed. But there are still many issues related to discrimination against the descendants of Indigenous women that still have not been addressed. So that's still an ongoing issue. So one of an elder, he's from British Columbia, and his name is Chief Dan George. And I remember when he came to travel in the Atlantic region when I was a wee one, and the way he presented himself and how he spoke really impacted me, even at a young age. And it's a name I never forgot. And when I was in university, I bought some more of his books, because he was also a poet. He was a chief. He was an author. He was an actor. You'll see him in some old Hollywood movies back in the day. He was from the Tsawit Nation in Burrard near Vancouver. And so I really liked a lot of his poetry. So if you get a chance to please Google Chief Dan George, Google some of his poetry, because it's really powerful and really talks about the ache in our hearts as Indigenous people during this time of Confederation, and what impacts and trauma were inflicted on our ancestors during that period of time, which we continue to live with today. And so this is one of the quotes that I wanted to share with you, because it's all about a matter of perspective. So when we're talking about how Canada became a country, and the laws that it has created, and the constitutions, and how it has treated you would, if you only saw one side of the story, you would think, well, you know, Canada has a lot to be proud of. But if you look at the perspective of Indigenous people and what has happened to our nations since Confederation, there's a lot of things not to be proud of. And it's always important to learn many perspectives and share and know that there's more than the history that we have been taught within our educational system. And I know that's changing. And I know education systems are trying to do better. But I know I didn't learn a lot about my history when I was a student going through the education system. I learned a lot more when I became a university student and sought out that knowledge of that history. So in this quote, he says, when I fought to protect my land and my home, I was called a savage. When I neither understood nor welcomed his way of life, I was called lazy. When I tried to rule my people, I was stripped of my authority. And this is Chief Dan George's quote from 1967, and that's essentially the history of what happened to Indigenous nations across Canada. Our land was stolen. We were called savages. The concept of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery were legal words used to justify the stealing of Indigenous lands. And we were told that terra nullius is a concept that means unoccupied lands. Canada, previous to before it was known as Canada, many parts of it were parts of those 60 Indigenous nations that I talked about in Mi'kma'ki, the map that I showed earlier. We encompassed all that territory, and it was not unoccupied. And in decisions, if you look at some court decisions written in the 1920s in Nova Scotia, Gabriel Syliboy, that decision, we were pretty much told that our peoples, our ancestors, were incapable of entering into treaties because we were like savages. So there was this use of the law and use of legal terminology that was used against us to justify these very negative actions. And when we didn't welcome the way of life of the European nations that came here, we were called lazy, and we were stripped of our Indigenous governance systems. And so this statement really does say a lot. And Mi'kmaq Treaties on Trial is a book written by William Wiccan. It's a really great book. I would recommend individuals read if you want to learn more about Mi'kmaq treaties, but how, despite the fact that we had these international agreements that were signed between two nations, and the beneficiaries to those treaties are all of us as Atlantic Canadians, treaties would not be given any formal recognition under law if it weren't for individuals such as Grand Chief Syliboy, the case that I referred to earlier. Even though the courts found that we were incapable of entering into treaties, we still had individuals who like Gabriel Syliboy, who argued within the courts and continued to argue within the courts. And so in 1982, when the Constitution of Canada was repatriated and brought home, Section 35(1) was included within the Constitution. There was a section, a reference made to the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. So when that Constitution came home and that section was included, many Indigenous people thought it was a victory and cause for celebration, because within the Constitution of Canada, which is the supreme law of the land, which means if there's any other laws that are in conflict with the Constitution always reigns supreme over it. So if the Constitution are recognizing the treaty rights of the Mi'kmaq, for instance, and we've gone through a number of treaties that we talked about earlier, you know, many of them you would think, okay, good, from 1982 we wouldn't have to go to court and to get recognition of our treaty rights. And in fact, we continue to do so today. It still happens today, But in 1985, in Canada, James Matthew Simon, it was the first time that our treaties were recognized as valid and enforceable in Canada, because the previous decision in Syllaboy said that our treaties weren't valid. So you would think after 1985, then we wouldn't have to go to court to argue the 1752 treaty that was still valid. But what the courts did is they created another term, a legal fiction. They called it sui generis, and they labeled our treaties of their own kind, because they did not want to recognize that treaties could be international in nature and essentially recognize the sovereign nations of Indigenous nations within Canada. And so, so that is what is the courts have created other terms to characterize the treaties as something less than international. And then in 1997, within Nova Scotia, Bill C-30 was passed, the Mi'kmaq Education Act, and it becomes the first agreement in Canada that transferred jurisdiction for education to the Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia. And legal recognition, again, I was talking earlier, yes, we had the Constitution that recognized treaties as having constitutional protection and supremacy in law. But again, 1999, Donald Marshall Jr. Successfully had to go to court, took numerous years and lots of resources. But eventually, the Supreme Court of Canada recognized that Donald Marshall Jr. And Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik and the Passamaquoddy people had a treaty right to make a moderate livelihood from what we hunt, fish, and gather, and that these rights flow from the series of the 1760 and 61 treaties that were signed with the British Crown. So that was in 1999. And this is a picture of Donald Marshall Jr. But since Marshall, that decision came down, you would think, okay, well, finally, this Canada and the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized that Mi'kmaq have a treaty right to make a moderate livelihood off what they hunt, fish, and gather within Mi'kmaqi. But there's not one community currently right now who is hunting, fishing, or gathering under treaty protection. In fact, there's still individuals being charged to this day if they're out fishing under their treaty fishery. So it's one of these cases of, well, you know, if there's a legal system and a law that says there's recognition, but in effect it's not being recognized or given meaning, how as we as Mi'kmaq people have faith within the institutions that are meant to uphold the rule of law, when the rule of law said we have these constitutionally protected treaty rights recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada, and yet individual Mi'kmaq people are still getting charged for practicing their treaty right. There are commercial fishing happening right now, but it's happening under interim fishing agreements, and those interim fishing agreements have been in existence for, well, since 1999. So that's 1999. That's over 20 years. So what are the next steps? Because I know there's a lot of individuals on here who are here with open minds and open hearts and are wondering, well, what can we do? What's our next steps? And the theme of the series of discussions that are happening here is about decolonization. And I really like one of the words that I've been hearing a lot when people are talking about decolonization. We need to do reconciliation. But reconciliation is not just reconciliation, it's reconciliation. And this is where I say, I quote an elder, Jane Meter, who is also one of the panelists on this, who was one of the organizers, and I like the way she defined it. And I think we can all walk away with something to think about by listening to this. Jane Meter said there are 4 parts to reconciliation in Mi'kmaq ways of knowing. First, there's the apology, then there's restitution, next there's forgiveness, and finally there's reconciliation. So reconciliation is a word, but there's many things that need to happen before we get reconciliation. apology is the first step, but there's restitution. And I think that's where we're at. She said Indigenous people are always expected to forgive, but restitution must happen first, and it's not always about money. So what role can we play? I've got a few recommendations here before my time is up and we leave this up to questions. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission called on all bodies to repudiate the concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and the reformation of policies within their constitutions that continue to rely on such concepts. The TRC, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also called for Canada to jointly develop with Indigenous peoples a royal proclamation of reconciliation to be issued by the Crown. This proclamation could be built on the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara of 1764, and the Peace and Friendship Treaties that we talked about earlier, that reaffirms that nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. And you know, if you Google Treaty of Niagara later, you'll notice it's a wampum, and it's got two rows parallel with each other, and that's essentially what the Treaty Niagara means. We have two nations operating in parallel: the European or the Canadian and Indigenous nations, and they each are responsible for their own governments and their own peoples, but they work together and they're on a common path. The proclamation would include a commitment to repudiate concepts that were used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples. I apologize for my dogs or someone at the door. That's what happens with Zoom and stuff, please. Such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. And I'm almost done, and I can put it on mute. So what role can we play? We can call on the government to honor the treaties. That's so important. Honor those the initial international agreements that we're all benefiting from. Actually, it's Canadians benefiting from more than the Mi'kmaq, because we've been denied that beneficiary since then. Call on the government to implement the treaties. We need to call on the government to honor all founding nations, because that's another misconception. Because of the concept of terra nullius and the legal justification used to steal the lands of Indigenous nations. There were other Indigenous nations here. We were here as Mi'kmaq. So were other Indigenous nations all across Canada. So Canada needs to honor all Indigenous nations, not as founding nations. Call on the Atlantic provinces to give official status to our languages, and call on the government to implement compensation and restitution on past wrongs. And with that, thank you very much. And I need to stop sharing, I think. Hey, here we go.
Gotta unmute myself. That was great, Cheryl. Thank you so much. Just gonna wait and see if Jane's coming back. Do you need to take care of your dog? Do you have to go and do anything, Cheryl?
I've got it on. I'm gonna put you guys on mute so you won't hear them barking, but I think they just heard someone at the door. Maybe I'll just check see who's there.
Okay. Welcome back, Jane.
Yeah, good to be back.
No dogs in your backyard.
No, I have a cat.
Okay, so while we wait for Cheryl to come back on, what are your thoughts on what she was talking about, Jane?
I don't know. I really enjoyed what she said, but one thing that when she talked about centralization, something that she just forgot to mention is during that centralization period, there was one community that was completely emptied. And right now people are using it for their summer homes and stuff, but it never went back to being that indigenous community, and that was Mulligawash near Orangedale. That was completely emptied out, you know, of its people. And but I really liked her presentation. I always enjoy listening to Cheryl, and I always learn more every time I listen to her presentation. By the way, I looked up that painting. It's I didn't know it either, but I looked it up. It's in the Mi'kmaq Portrait Collection, and it's from 1791.
Ah, thank you, Janie.
Grandfather Google helping you out again there, Janie?
Oh yes, always.
Yeah, okay, so thanks, Cheryl, again. So one of the questions that I have, and it's in line with some of the questions that we've received from the participants, and it's particularly relevant, I think, because like you're so involved in the Human Rights Commission of Nova Scotia. So do you think, is it possible to decolonize government institutions? And the example that was given here was courts and social services and whatnot. But I would say just in general, what are the hurdles that you see going forward to work with provincial institutions and other government institutions? Just a small question.
Wow, yeah, just tiny, Mary Beth, just tiny. You know, it's really funny because when we did our little call yesterday with Nicole, when we kind of did a pre-run for this presentation, and she reminded me that I had met her 2 years ago. Actually, it wasn't Nicole, but it was, I'm so bad with names. Anyway, I met the organizers of this group, and it was at an event that was organized in Membertou. Janie was there, and later on that evening, we experienced, I personally experienced for the first time the blanket exercise. And it was such a moving, emotional experience as an Indigenous woman sitting there, seeing our history condensed in an exercise, and seeing it as an observer, but knowing that was my ancestors went through all of that. It was very emotional. But I wasn't the only one with wet eyes in that room. I think everybody experienced that from a very emotional, spiritual perspective, and walking away with, oh, we need to do something. What can we do as allies to help change our institutions and our systems and our ways of being? And at that time, you know, I said, you know, we need to have more of these. For instance, I think if we're going to change institutions, we got to start with individuals. And changing individuals begins with changing people's minds and hearts, which is what the work that you guys are doing through this institution. And the way to do that is having these kind of events, but also I think that blanket exercise is something every Nova Scotian individual should experience, and experience it with Janie Meter, because Janie was one of them. And
I was there too. Nicole was there, and Alexander, we were all there. It was
okay. Yes. So we were all there, and we all experienced that powerful moment of like common mind and common hearts and common spirit. And so I think we got to start with baby steps, and baby steps means educating people about the history, and not just the one-sided history we've learned and unfortunately are only exposed to, or the one perspective, or the one. We need to be exposed to and learn of all the histories of this area, and the experiences and the impacts of these colonization on the Indigenous people within their traditional territories. And then we need to reevaluate and examine and challenge these institutions that are governing, adjudicating, making policy decisions, governing, all of that to include that perspective.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that you brought that up because it was totally unprompted. But I think it's important. I think it's an important point to make. So the Community Sector Council, as Nicole was talking about earlier today, they've been doing this for a long time, and we were interviewed this morning for CBC, and we were talking about how long we've been working on this journey together. But one of the reasons why I have committed to helping and working with the Community Sector Council is because of that retreat. They planned a 3-day retreat a couple of years ago. Everyone in the organization from all across Nova Scotia came to Untitled to here to Membertou. They spent 3 days, which isn't easy to give up considering, like everybody knows how hard it is to give up those days. We toured around Eskasoni, we toured around Membertou, we listened to people like yourself and to both of you, Jane and Cheryl, did a blanket exercise. And it was their whole board, all of the board of directors, as well as the funders and employees. And I think that I've been hearing from the organization that really was an impactful experience. But we have to make time, I think is the point there, is we have to make time as organizations to really commit to doing some learning and unlearning around this before jumping in and trying to fix things. We really have to understand the extent of the problem. So yeah, that's funny that you brought that up. That was an emotional night. I remember it myself.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so some other questions that came in from the groups related to lots of different issues. One of them was the continual marginalization of First Nations females through the Indian Act, which Cheryl, you touched on, today. And one of the questions that came in just this afternoon was, but what happened to Indigenous women when they left, but when non-Indigenous women married Indigenous men, what happened there? Or when you have a female who is non-Indian marrying an Indian man, do they also change their status? Did the men lose their status? No.
So previous to 1985, when the Bill C-31 came in, it was discriminatory because Indigenous males could marry non-Indigenous females, and the Indigenous men wouldn't lose status, but the non-Indigenous females would gain status. And the Indigenous females, if they married the non-Indigenous male, would lose their status, and the non-Indigenous male would not gain status. So after 1985, they stopped that. So Indigenous men and Indigenous women after 1985, if they married non-Indigenous men or women, the non-Indigenous men and women wouldn't gain status.
So complicated.
Yeah, you know, sometimes
that numbers game.
Charts, you almost need charts to explain it all, because it gets more complicated as the court decisions continue to happen, because discrimination stops at that level, then it moves to the children level, then it moves to the grandchildren level. You know what I mean? So it goes to generation after that. So I've heard Pam Palmater present on this, and she said, you know, Canada needs to step up and just create a law that ends that discriminatory practice, and for all generations, not just for 3 or 4 generations.
Yeah.
One of the problems too that with the women being discriminated against is that we are a matrilineal society. All our clans come from the mother, or so one of the things that was happening too is if an Indigenous man married a non-Indigenous woman, the children didn't have a clan to belong to. So there were, you know, in those ceremonies that are really important for those families. So it broke family ties too. So there were a lot of implications within our communities.
Mm-hmm. So Jane, this is another question that came in for this session, but do you get frustrated with the lack of settler knowledge on these topics? And if yes, what do you do? And that's a question you can both address if you like.
No, I'm not frustrated with the lack of settler knowledge. I'm frustrated with the educational system. I am frustrated with the government because it's almost like the settler knowledge, I can't blame them because you don't know what you don't know. You can't help that. But I do blame the educational system, and I do blame the government and all the judicial systems, because they are the ones that should be educating everybody. They should be educating all Canadians. So I'm more, I guess I'm more frustrated with them, with the government agencies.
Cheryl, where's your frustration level?
My frustration level. Well, you know what? There's again, I'm mentioning Pam Palmater because I find she is very, very eloquent and knowledgeable about a lot of things, and has a way of expressing the frustration, about what's happening in Canada, and but also in a gentle way, to let people know, we have to sit in these uncomfortable conversations, because that's what needs to happen. And as settlers and as our allies, you have to be open to that. That's so important. It needs to happen because there's a lot of pain. And I think that's why I talk about that blanket exercise, because that was it was a safe, non-judgmental way to experience that trauma and pain that Indigenous peoples have been experiencing for multi-generations and continue to experience today. And that's one of the points I find from Pam that I really like, is she said, when people say, why don't you get over it? And she'll say, well, how can we get over it when the trauma is continued to be inflicted on us today, right? So the healing can't start until that trauma that's Indigenous people are being inflicted on ends. And it's so profound, but it just means, when you're sitting, people need to sit together and have these uncomfortable conversations and be open to feeling these this pain and this hurt, and then let's see what comes from it. But so I'll give a link to that, one of the presentations where she does a really great succinct presentation about all of this, because she talks about reconciliation with that.
I think that would be great, and that's one of the other things, since it's coming up. But there's a lot of questions that we've been getting this week about what can I do over the summer, how can I do some learning, what books can you recommend, and the Community Sector Council group are going to, on their website, have a set of resources that give you different information. We can add Pam Palmater, because just when you said that, that reminded me, like, she has a YouTube channel, and she did a bunch of book reviews last fall where she was encouraging people to read different books about that would help them inform themselves about what some of the issues are. So if people are looking for books to read over the summer, there's a list there. Jane suggested there's a Vimeo documentary on the pass system that's available through Vimeo. I think it's $5, but that talks about the illegal pass system, keeping people on the reserves. There's also a number of books that might be, I mean, this is a very difficult topic, so some of the books that I recommend to students, for example, are a little bit more accessible. And so there's some Massey lectures by Thomas King. There's Massey lecture by Tanya Talaga. Seven Fallen Feathers is another good one. Oh, there's so many, so many that I could list, as well as Truth and Conviction by Jane McMillan, writing about Donald Marshall. Like, there's so many resources that are out there that people can go and pick them up and take them. And there's also audiobooks that I listen to, so many different audiobooks. So I could just ramble on and on about different books that we'll put on the website. But do you guys have any top recommendations for things and resources that you would give to people, or you like to give to people?
Well, that Vimeo video you were talking about, it's free until the end of the month. If you type in justice as a password, or not as a password, but a code word, and it won't cost you anything. There is a really great movie that came out a couple of years ago. I don't know if you can see it on there. See this?
The Doctrine of a Discovery, yep. Unmaking, okay. Is it Unmaking the Domination Code, is that what it says?
Unmasking.
Okay.
And it's directed by Sheldon Wolfchild, who used to be married to Buffy St. Marie. And it's co-produced by Steve Newcomb, who is a Lenape lawyer who's been talking about this doctrine of discovery, and is probably the greatest authority on this doctrine of discovery. And it's narrated by Buffy St. Marie. It's a great documentary. I would recommend that. And if you can, although he's American, but it's still pertinent to Canada, and because of this. And if you can, look him up on a website, because he does talk about the doctrine of discovery, and he works with. I had the opportunity to be at a presentation with him and with his daughter. So it's a really good presentation, and it shows how most of the lands in North America, South America, New Zealand, Australia, Africa, the Pacific Islands, they're all sitting on lands that were illegally obtained. So it's really interesting. It's good. It's good education for everybody, our people included.
Great, thanks. Cheryl, do you have any top recommendations that you would make?
All those authors that you mentioned, I would recommend. The ones you didn't mention was Richard Wagamese. He's written quite a bit of books. They're fiction, but I really love them because there's a way of telling the story. You know, it's all about the art of storytelling and feeling the feeling of the history through that way of telling the story. And a lot of his books, I absolutely love the way he does it. So I recommend him. And I also wanted to say I just sent the link for Pam Palmer's presentation to you, Mary Beth, and Nicole. So potentially they could be shared there.
Okay.
And if you want to learn a little bit about our spirituality, a great book is by Sherry Mitchell from, she's Passamaquoddy from Maine, Dr. Sherry Mitchell. And it's called, oh, I even forget the name of it right now. I'll find it and I'll send it to you.
Sounds like we're going to have lots of resources available, Nicole. And just since you're mentioning all of these things, I'm noticing, and I think it'd be helpful perhaps to add this question. It didn't come in from the audience, but it's coming from me. What are your thoughts on, like you've been saying, resources that are available? They're Americans that wrote it. They're not Canadians, but I'm wondering if some of the final thoughts just about what people should be thinking about in terms of America and Canada, or the United States and Canada, because I mean the border was a false border. It cut through a lot of First Nations communities, including Mi'kma'ki, and so what are the differences now, or what does that imply, or what does that mean now in 2020 when some of our communities still have borders through them? Cheryl, maybe you want to address that first.
So 2020 and the borders, there's so many, I mean, we have a very similar colonial history, like as American, Native Americans and Indigenous or First Nations in Canada. I did have an opportunity to live in Gordon University in Arizona and had a chance to work with one of the tribal courts and work with some of the Native American tribes down there. And I see a lot of differences because they recognize domestic dependent sovereignty within the Native American tribes in the United States early on in the 1800s with the Marshall trilogy of cases. And as a result, they're able to have, a lot of them have their own courts within their communities, something that Canada has not recognized here. But at the same time, you know, so there's a lot of differences, similarities, but because of the recent colonial history, but we have so much to learn from each other and shared experiences. Yeah, I guess it's my comment on that.
Thanks. I know it's not straightforward, but we get the same question. I mean, I get the same question, and it's definitely different. There's population differences and whatnot, but there's also a lot of similarities. So it's really interesting to look at the colonial governments and the way that they treated Indians in the past, and then how that's carried forward. Even our own, you know, like multiculturalism, the assumption about multiculturalism in Canada, but that was really just, or started out as biculturalism to recognize French and English and prevent wars between them from continuing. So multiculturalism expanded over time to include everybody, but it wasn't designed to do that. So it's interesting. Jane, what are your thoughts? I see Nicole starting to get anxious because I think we're running out of time. So.
No, I had a question I wanted to put out there, but I'll wait.
Okay.
Go ahead, what's your question?
Well, what I'm wondering is, you know, some of the COVID restrictions are starting to lift and we're moving into a summer time period. And I'm wondering what the three of you might suggest that families and individuals can do over the summer. So we've had this great list of resources that we'll happily share, but what might you suggest that we can go and do to learn more?
So my suggestion, I mean, in Nova Scotia especially, but across the country, there's more. If museums start opening up, if cultural centers and cultural heritage sites start opening up, there's a lot of really great things that governments are starting to do to make information more accessible. So like the Fortress of Louisbourg, they've added a lot of information around Mi'kmaq history there. I think most of the museums in Nova Scotia have done something similar. So if they're open, take those in. That would be my recommendation, I think.
What's your sense? Do you think that any of the powwows that normally happen in the summer will be scheduled this year? I mean, I've always found that an incredible place to learn and to celebrate and get to know the culture and language and wonderful people. What are your thoughts?
Powwows are amazing and they're fun and there's great Indian tacos and lots of food. But unfortunately, because of COVID, a lot of them have been canceled for this summer. But I was going to suggest there are other areas. I'm not sure if they're open. You'd have to double check. But Eskasoni, for instance, has the Goat Island. It's a trail and it's absolutely beautiful. And I see it, you know, you can walk at your own pace and they have lots of little learning stations all around. I don't know how long it is, but I've done the walk. So if I can do it, anybody can do it. The other trail in Waigoma First Nations called the Sky River Trail. And it's just right beside, it's in the community right by the Sky River. That one's even shorter walk. And so there's those kinds of things you could do in a post or during COVID world that to learn a little bit about a history. Of course, there's also the Membertou Heritage Park, but that's closed because of COVID as well. So
thank you.
I think I know what Janie's looking for, and I found it for you, Janie. Sacred Instructions.
That's exactly what I was looking
Yes.
for.
So you had my back, I have yours.
Oh, thank
Sacred
you.
Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change. So that is actually, it is an awesome book. I read that one too.
But the other thing, if you have the opportunity and you really want to learn more about us, and if you have a chance, attend a pipe ceremony. Those sacred ceremonies are, a powwow is good, they're fun, they're interesting, I like going to them, but they're more of a social gathering. The ceremonies, on the other hand, are spiritual gatherings, and you learn a lot more, I think, at the ceremonies if you have the opportunity to go to a pipe ceremony. If you can go to a sweat lodge, by all means do that. Some of our ceremonies have been canceled due to COVID-19. Like this year, we can't have our Sundance because of COVID-19. But when things open back up, make the opportunity to go into some of those ceremonies.
Thank you, Jane.
So Jane, just to add on that a little bit, I know this is a question that a lot of people have, but how do you connect with people when to learn about ceremonies? We can't all go to your house and go in the backyard for a sweat. So do you have any suggestions about where people can access resources for stuff like that?
Where you can get those is if you call, usually if you can get a hold of people at the band office or the school, well, the schools are closed now, but if you can get a hold of people at the band offices at heritage parks, they usually know the elders and they usually know who runs the ceremonies and when they're going on. So if you can get that information, from them, I think it's the best way. But I want to tell you, please be careful, because what's happening now is there are people who are identifying as Mi'kmaq, as Indigenous, and are not Indigenous, and they're taking money. If somebody is going to charge you $99.99 to smudge out your house, more than likely they're not Indigenous. So there are people out there who are doing this stuff, but are doing it for the money, and not because it's based on spirit or based on our teachings. So you need to be really careful. Ask, do your research. Do your research. Don't just take somebody's word for it.
Great. Thank you so much. So Nicole, I think we're pretty much out of time now. It's getting hot out there, so I know people are going to want to, at least in Nova Scotia, people are going to want to get away from their computers.
You must have been reading my lips.
Guys, Cheryl's trying to get away from her computer. It's hot.
It was very subtle. Yeah, I just really want to thank you, Cheryl, very much for joining us. It's been 2 years since we last met, so it's really wonderful to be reconnected. And thank you for bringing back to life that incredible experience that we did have as Community Sector Council board and staff. It was a very deep learning journey for us and a continued one. And it's because the three of you, Mary Beth, Jane, and Cheryl, you really held us and set us off in the right direction. And this whole project has been born out of that initiative. So deep thanks for your participation today and sharing your wealth of knowledge, and for when we first came together a couple years ago. I just want to say that I continue to learn. I've heard a presentation like this several times, and I just continue to learn and be astounded by the shared history, Canada's shared history that we certainly weren't taught in elementary school, in secondary school, and even post-secondary school. It was obviously very biased and one-sided. So again, Cheryl, deep appreciation for sharing your knowledge today. As I think every citizen in Canada, we really need to relearn. And then, as said, by each of us learning and unlearning, we can develop that change within us as individuals. And when enough of us have developed that change and that intention to make change, we can start to shift organizations and shift systems. So this is a huge part of that. So thank you.
And that blanket exercise everybody's been talking about, you can get a hold of Kairos Canada. If you get a hold of them, they will let you know who in your area will do the blanket exercise for you, and you can probably get them for a school or for an organization, they'll come in and do that blanket exercise and bring in elders and bring in the knowledge keepers.
Yeah, it's tremendously powerful. So I would highly recommend it to anyone to participate in or to organize it in your community. One of the things we've been hearing from folks through surveys is that they're really wanting more trusted resources. So many resources have been shared today. So we've been documenting all of that, and we'll be sharing that in a resource document following this webinar. You'll get that in a couple of days when we share the webinar back out. And in addition to that, we'll make sure Jane's got some wonderful suggestions for children's books as well. So we want to make sure that the little ones in our families are included in this learning too. So we'll send out some additional resources. So just a huge thank you. This is the fourth, as I mentioned, in this series 1. So we're kind of doing a wrap, at least for the summer, and we'll be back in the fall. So just a huge thanks to you, Mary Beth, and to Jane for helping to hold this center, hold this circle for the last 4 weeks. Thank you for your grace and your patience, your pointed clarity, and your time and your wisdom. And I look forward to coming back together with you in the fall. And for those of you on the call, as always, we're always looking for feedback. This team will be coming back together over the summer to do some debriefing and some redesigning for the fall and the winter. So your feedback is really important and really, really appreciated. So thank you all, and I'll turn it back to Mary Beth, to Cheryl, and to Jane to close us out. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't have anything really additional to add. This has been really a great experience for me. I'm always happy to be able to work with Nicole and the Community Sector Council group. They're a small but mighty group, just like we are in Unama'ki College and at CBU, small but mighty. And I'm really happy to be doing that. Cheryl, what are you going to make dinner tonight? Can I come over for dinner?
Indian tacos on the menu.
Any final thoughts, Cheryl?
Just to say thank you, or walalio, for giving me this opportunity to share information, and thank you so much. Very honored.
Thanks. And Jane, any last thoughts from you going into the summer?
Just one thing I forgot to mention, and I should mention it. It's a great resource if you can look it up. And they also have great YouTube videos that have a lot of good information on them. And it's called the turtlelodge.org. It's based in Manitoba. And they have some amazing resources and movies and just the elders and the wisdom keepers that are there. And they share a lot of good information with everybody and a lot of good teachings. So if you can look up the turtlelodge.org and you'll find good things too on YouTube. And the person who's leading that, his name is Dave Courchene, Courchene. So if you can look him up, Dave Courchene Jr., he's got really good videos that explain a lot about our spirituality and our history. So the summer, I don't know, just educate yourself. Let's all educate ourselves, you know. And the other thing I was trying to find, I just wanted to let you know that we're talking about, when we talk about settler mentality, we are not talking about Black people because they are not settlers. They don't fall into that category because they've been taken from their lands. They didn't choose to come to America. They didn't choose to come to Canada. They were taken, forced migration for them. And so they don't fall underneath that settler mentality. And there's a different name that I can't quite remember. It's like a replanted, or I forget what it is, because they were taken from Africa and brought here. So they don't fall underneath in that. The settler mentality is a mentality that's Eurocentric. That's the one we call settler mentality. Just want to let you know that.
Okay, great. And just, I would like to add that when you mention YouTube, there are some really great resources on YouTube. Shubenacadie College also has a YouTube channel that has lots of information that you can watch videos from all across the country around a lot on Indigenous business, but just on Indigenous traditions from across the country as well. And that's on the YouTube channel. But I guess my thought on that final closing is the same advice that I would give to students when they're watching videos is, you know, really use some critical thinking skills when you're watching these things. Ask, you know, like, why is this uncomfortable? How accurate do I think this information is? How true do I think it is? Or why do I not believe it? And then go back and look at some of the resources. A lot of the resources we're sharing are connected to university or education systems. So they're really well researched, but there are some out there that aren't as well researched. So just some critical thought there. So on that note,
resources too on the Métis of Alberta and Manitoba, Saskatchewan. A lot of good resources on Louis Riel and Dumont and their struggle in Canada. And the Northwest Rebellion. And there's a new book that just came out last year about the Métis history. It's called The Northwest is Our Mother.
Great. So Jane, I'll give the last word to you to send us away in a good way for the summer. And yeah, last word to you.
I don't know what to say, but I really appreciate anybody and everybody who came to listen, and anybody who's been active and participating in this webinar. I hope that, you know, we've been able to teach you some things, and maybe that you've been able to unlearn some things. I know I have learned a lot of good things from here, and I'm looking forward to a time that I keep talking about, a time I think that our prophecies have talked about, and that's the time when we can all walk hand in hand, not only as allies, but as brothers and sisters on this land. Butch, thank you. And Yawa,
Lalan.
All yok.